Hello, so today we're going to be talking about France and Italy. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about Napoleon III of France. We're going to look at his domestic policy, so what he did for France itself. We're going to be looking at his foreign policy. We'll talk about how successful or not successful those things were. And then we're going to talk about how Italy became a unified nation. And France is actually going to be a major player in that. That's part of France's foreign policy. So there is a relationship between these two topics here. All right, so where we last left off in France, right, Louis Napoleon has just declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, or the third, marking the beginning of France's Second Empire. So I recognize that there's some confusing numbers there. I'm honestly not sure why he's Napoleon III. I'm suspecting a member of the family declared themselves Napoleon II, but never ruled. So yeah, Napoleon III, Second Empire makes sense, right, because the first one was original flavor Napoleon, right? Now, historians commonly view Napoleon III's domestic policy is actually pretty successful. It does keep France pretty stable. Napoleon III is not overthrown by his own people. He ends up being actually overthrown by the Germans. We'll talk about that later. So in terms of all the French leaders that we've seen in like the last 100 years or so, that's pretty good, right? However, his foreign policy, much less successful. So there are three major disasters that befall his regime. The first one is his quote-unquote Mexican adventure. Yes, they do call it that. His involvement in the Crimean War. And then the one that really does him in, the war in which he is overthrown, is the Franco-Prussian War. And we're actually going to talk about that next lecture when we talk about Germany, because the Franco-Prussian War is really important in the unification of Germany. So we'll talk about it in that context instead. But it is a big failure for Napoleon, so we'll get there. All right, Napoleon III's domestic policy. So Napoleon III is kind of interesting in that he starts out pretty conservative, but he ends up liberalizing a little bit in order to maintain stability, which is kind of in itself a conservative goal, right? So we're actually going to see that is a pattern among some other politicians of sort of the mid-late 19th century. So we'll talk about that. So initially, again, a very conservative, very authoritarian. Napoleon III is the only person who's allowed to introduce legislation and policy and declare war. There is some kind of a legislature. It's called the Legislative Corps, and it's actually elected by universal suffrage, so that's pretty liberal, right? Everybody can vote for people to go to the Legislative Corps, but the problem is they don't hold any actual power. They're just there to kind of say, cool, Napoleon III, we like what you're doing, keep doing it, right? So it's kind of there to grant him some legitimacy, but it can't really do anything. So what does Napoleon III do once he gets into power? Well, one of the biggest things he does is he actually rebuilds Paris. And this is conducted by this guy named Baron Haussmann under the direction of Napoleon. So you'll also see this called the Haussmannization of Paris. Now, one of the goals, or at least the public goal of this policy, was to improve public health and safety. So for example, they built a sewer system, they installed street lights, all right, so it's easier to see crime happening at night. But there was kind of an underlying motive as well. And this was to discourage revolution. You're like, what? Wait, how does rebuilding the city discourage revolution? Well, if you've ever seen Les Mis, you know that when French people prior to this revolted, they like to barricade the streets, right? So they throw a bunch of furniture down in the streets, and that slows the police down. It helps stop them from getting to the revolutionaries, right? Well, Napoleon looks at this and he's like, well, I don't want people to rebel against me. So what am I going to do? Well, I'll just make it harder for them to barricade the streets. So problem solved. And that actually works. He doesn't experience any revolutions, although that's partly due to some other stuff he does later, which we'll talk about in a second. Another thing that Napoleon does in terms of policy, he actually has a really successful economic policy. So he really helps France industrialize. How does he do that? Well, it's largely through infrastructure projects. So he builds railways, right? We know that's really important. That really helped Britain industrialize because you can move goods and workers around, right? He builds roads, he builds canals, so all kinds of stuff like that. All right, so just to illustrate the Haussmannization of Paris, he did have people go around and take pictures of sort of pre-Haussmann Paris. You can see that there. Very narrow streets, right? It's kind of grungy and grimy. This is Paris today. So nice wide streets, very clean, very pretty. This is probably what you associate with Paris. He builds some parks. So some beautification. And then that sort of like classic Parisian look of the buildings, that's actually Haussmann and Napoleon III. So Paris did not look like that prior to the mid-19th century. You also see this style of architecture called Second Empire after Napoleon. So that's where that comes from. All right, but there is kind of a problem here, right? So Napoleon is pouring huge amounts of money into the French economy, rebuilding the entire city of Paris. That's really expensive, right? And it plunges France into debt. So people are upset with that. This is kind of a classic French problem, right? And then, of course, he kind of faces opposition from the middle class and the working class, right? So liberals don't like the fact that there's kind of like this fake legislature, right? They can't actually do anything. They don't like his policies of censorship. And then Napoleon doesn't really do a whole lot to benefit the workers. So as a result, workers and socialists are just not happy about his regime at all. They're like, he's not protecting us. We're industrializing and we need help. So as a result, Napoleon actually responds to some of their criticisms, which is honestly pretty cool. Politicians don't always do that, right? So he does liberalize his regime a little bit. So some of the things he does, he grants the legislative corps a little bit more power. So he gives them control over the budget. They still can't really pass legislation, but they can control the budget. So they can control policy that way. He allows opposition parties to form. And then in order to benefit the workers, he actually legalizes trade unions and he legalizes the right to strike. And that happens a lot later in the United States, for example, so pretty cool on Napoleon there. All right, but his foreign policy, as we mentioned, right, a little bit less successful. So his first big failure is in Mexico. So as we know, right, Napoleon wants to sort of help France's economy. So what he decides to do is he's like, well, why don't we try and make it easier to sell French goods in Mexico, right? Create demand for French goods. So he decides that in order to do that, he needs to make the political situation in Mexico a little bit friendlier to him. So he meets up with his buddy, Maximilian of Austria, who is part of the Austrian royal family. And then he goes, hey, Maximilian, do you want to be emperor of Mexico? And Maximilian's like, sure, sounds like a real cool vacation. But as you can imagine, right, you can't just, a foreign power can't just install a random leader of a country. That doesn't usually go well. So Maximilian is pretty quickly executed. And everyone knows that France put Maximilian there, so this makes Napoleon look really weak. And just as a fun little side note, this is actually the origin of Cinco de Mayo, because that is when Maximilian was overthrown on the 5th of May. So you can thank Napoleon for your romantic French Parisian vacation. You can thank him for Cinco de Mayo. So that's pretty cool, even if it wasn't for Napoleon. All right, second big failure is the Crimean War. And France actually doesn't lose this war. They're just hurt really badly by it because it's really bad for everyone involved. So just some context on this war, you're going to read about it in a little bit. Basically, this actually starts in Eastern Europe. So the context is the Ottoman Empire, big Muslim empire that starts kind of their base of power is in modern day Turkey. They're on the decline. And they control this really important area called the Dardanelles Strait, right? So if you want to sort of get into the Black Sea or out of the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, you got to go through there, right? So really important if you want to trade in that area of the world, right? So Russia sees the Ottoman Empire falling into decline, and sort of the one thing that Russia always wants in terms of foreign policies, they always want warm water ports, right? Because they can't do a lot of trading in sort of the northern part of Russia because so the North Sea is always frozen over, right? Or not always, but it's often frozen over, so they want access to warm water ports so they can trade with the rest of the world. So what does Russia do? They declare war on the Ottomans, right? Now here's the problem though. So France and Britain, right, they're still all participating in this concert of Europe. They want to maintain the balance of power. And that move that Russia just made to get the Dardanelles, that really scares them because it makes them think that Russia is trying for this power grab. And if they get the Dardanelles, they'll be way too powerful compared to other European states. So what do? They declare war on Russia. So now we've got this pan-European war. We've destroyed the concert of Europe, right? Russia does end up losing the war. So they are sort of the official losers of the war, but it's really bad for everyone involved. It's a really destructive war. Both sort of I won't say that. But so the reason why this is a failure for France is even though they kind of technically won the war, it was so damaging for them that it's just not a good mark on Napoleon's record. And if there's one thing you remember about the Crimean War in general, right, it destroys the concert of Europe. So that's going to kind of set up our foreign policy for Europe going forward. So just keep that in mind as we talk about this the rest of this unit. We don't have this organization that's trying to keep everyone in line. And that's going to create new opportunities for other countries to suddenly become very, very, very powerful. As you can imagine, that's going to create conflict. So the first result, actually, of the concert of Europe breaking is Italian unification, interestingly enough. So Italy is going to have this sort of movement for unification, and then we're not going to see the rest of Europe kind of want to control that or put that down, essentially. So what's going on here? So as we mentioned last time, during the Revolution of 1848, all these little Italian states, they try and gain independence from Austria. Some of them are under the control of Austria, or they just want a liberal constitution. It mostly fails, right? They don't gain independence, they don't gain constitutions, except for this little state called Piedmont. And Piedmont is going to be the one, so they get a liberal constitution, and they're going to be the ones that lead Italian unification for the most part. So their king is named Victor Emmanuel III, and he is going to lead this charge, or rather his prime minister, Camillo di Cavour, is going to lead this charge, and then Victor Emmanuel is going to back him up. So what Camillo de Cavour does is he slowly and steadily starts to modernize Piedmont. So he invests in industry and infrastructure, which increases Piedmont's wealth. And what he does is he uses all this money to increase the size of the army, because Cavour wants Italian unification, and he knows he can't do that without a military. So the problem is, though, that he's not ready to go up against Austria by himself, right? So Piedmont's not under the control of Austria, but he knows he's going to have to liberate his buddies from Austria's power if he wants to unify Italy. So what he does is he goes to Napoleon III, because, right, France is a great power. Good to have a great power back you up in a fight against another great power. So Napoleon III initially actually does help out. He sends some troops, but then he kind of gets cold feet. He realizes he doesn't really want to go up against Austria after all these other foreign policy failures, and he backs out, and he actually totally ghosts Cavour. He doesn't tell him he's backing out. So this is a big problem, right? But Cavour actually just keeps going on through. At this point, Italian nationalism has really built up a momentum. So it's not just Cavour, it's not just Victor Emmanuel. We've got all these sort of ordinary Italian people who are ready to take up arms and unify Italy. So it starts in the north. So nationalists seize Parma, Modena, Tuscany, part of the Papal State. So if you can't see it on the map, but it's kind of the northern part of Italy. But then we see this parallel movement develop in the south. So in southern Italy, we've got this nationalist named Garibaldi, and he's going to lead a revolt to liberate the kingdom of the two Sicilies. And then he's going to unify southern Italy. So we've got these two blobs kind of coming together, and they're about to meet in Rome. So Garibaldi actually tries to march on Rome, and then Cavour comes in. He's like, hey, Garibaldi, chill a little bit. Well, why does this happen? So basically, Cavour doesn't want Garibaldi to sack Italy because he's worried that that's going to upset France, and he doesn't want France as an enemy, right? France already ghosted him. He's like, France is no longer my friend, and I really don't want them as my enemy, right? So with that sort of problem solved, we don't have France involved anymore. The northern and southern blobs, halves of Italy, unite, and they unite under the leadership of Piedmont and King Victor Emmanuel, and we have, for the first time, since like the Roman Empire, actually, a unified nation of Italy. I did mention that they leave out Venetia and Rome, so Rome is on its own for a little while, but they are going to be added eventually, so stay tuned for that.